Welcome to the next video in the Dominion video tutorial series. This part is about forming your strategy and building your deck. So when you're starting a game of Dominion, you see the kingdom cards and you're thinking about, what am I going to do this game? The overarching question, the overarching goal is you want to build the best payload given the deck control resources available. That's what you're trying to do. In one sentence, that's Dominion strategy. We did it, guys. So how do you do that? Well, the first thing that I like to do to try and figure out what's possible is I understand my limitations. I look for deck control and see what all I can accomplish given the deck control resources available. So this is the order that I look at it in. I look for attacks and defense. I'm looking for ways my opponent can attack my deck control, discarding cards, giving me curses, and then whatever defense I can do about that. Also, if that's available, you probably want to be doing that to your opponent. But in terms of looking at deck control resources, that's at the top of the list. Then I look for trashing, villages, and draw. Okay, these things are the main deck control pieces that I'm looking for. And the presence of these, or the lack of these things, is going to help me understand what the best possible turn I could have is. How many cards can I draw? What can those cards do? Can I get extra buys? If you can know which cards you can play, that helps you know how good your turns can be. Let's say there's some limitations. There's a lot more detail I could go into about this, and I will link an episode of the podcast in the description where we talk more specifically about all of this stuff. But the short version is, if there are no villages, you want to look at all the non-terminals in the kingdom plus your favorite terminal per turn to play. That's the best turn you can have. If there's no draw, you look for draw neutral cards plus a certain amount of stop cards that you can have in your deck. So cantrips are draw neutral. You can have as many of those as you want. You could also have stuff like Festival plus Moat. It's not draw, but it's draw neutral, and it is still giving you some extra stuff for doing it. But past that, then stop cards are cards that are worse than draw neutral for your deck, and you can only have so many of those because you can't increase your hand size. And then finally, if there's no trashing, you want to look for other cycling resources. And so we talked about cycling. There's a whole episode about cycling of the podcast that I'll link in the description where we can go into way more detail if you're interested in that. Just keep in mind that these are significant restrictions. And yes, you can operate and do really cool stuff with all of these restrictions, but that shapes the context of all the decks that you can potentially build in any given game of Dominion. And so this is something you have to have in your head. So we've looked at deck control, we've understood our limitations, and then you start to look for payload. So let's talk about building your deck now. We talked about our strategy, but now we want to figure out, okay, well, I know what I want my deck to be. Now how do I get there? And to do that, I think it's beneficial to zoom out about 10,000 feet and take a look at how a game of Dominion goes. The first thing you do is you get control over your deck, then you make your deck do good stuff, and then you win the game with your deck. And those correspond to deck control, payload, and endgame play. In the beginning of the game, what's important to you is deck control. In the middle of the game, what's important to you is payload. And then at the end of the game, what's important to you is endgame play. We've talked about deck control and payload a lot. Endgame play we'll address later in this tutorial series because it's kind of difficult to talk about without a game situation, but there are things you can do to help yourself there. But really, you want a good deck, and that's going to give you lots more options for endgame play. If we zoom in just a little bit, then these priorities towards the top of the list are more important to you in the beginning of the game, and then as we move down the list, they become more important towards the middle and then towards the end of the game. So those priorities in order are trashing and junking. That is the most important thing at the start of the game. Trash your cards, give your opponent bad cards. Then there's gainers. Gainers are actually a little bit better to put in your deck a little earlier than draw cards in a lot of cases. So there's a little bit of payload in there, and then you work on draw. Then you put in the rest of your payload besides just gainers. Now, obviously, the lines between these are blurry, and this is just a rough idea of the priorities you have in a game of Dominion, but it's a good framework for figuring out what you want to do at any given point in the game. Once your deck is relatively under control and doing something that you like, or maybe the game is about to end because of some external factors, at some point in the game you're going to ask yourself, how do I win? And then you're going to try and execute that plan. A couple of gotchas where you're prioritizing these things. The first one, playing an attack card is payload. That was the definition. However, if that attack is a deck control attack that hurts your opponent's deck control, then you need to prioritize buying and playing that attack like you would prioritize deck control. And that's why junking is on the same level as trashing. Junking technically is playing an attack card, so it's technically payload, but we prioritize it like deck control because it has that effect on our opponent. And then the other one, which is a little more complicated, is if you need to add some payload to your deck, like a silver, for example, to buy a deck control card that you can't afford at the start of the game, like maybe a junker or a trasher that costs $5, then even though there may be a draw card that you could get right away, you need to prioritize that silver the same way you would prioritize the deck control. So buying a silver, even though it isn't a trashing card, if it helps you buy a trashing card soon, then you need to prioritize it that way. Those are the main exceptions to when you would prioritize things and how you would do it. And then this all leads us to evaluating how good a card is for your deck, and specifically what the best card is for your deck right now, because you can look at what the card does. You can look at that card's payload and deck control components, and you can figure out what you need at this point in the game. At the beginning of the game, I'm looking for deck control, specifically trashing and junking. Then I'm looking for payload in the form of gainers. And at the beginning of the game, these are the two most important things for me. As we move along, my deck is going to need some more draw, and that's going to become more important. And so this is, you can use the basic roadmap, get control over my deck, add payload to my deck while still drawing it, win the game with my deck, for example, to know where you are in the game, what kind of cards you need, and then identify which cards fit the criteria of what you need, and that will help you evaluate what the best card is for your deck right now. And then once you start drawing your deck, so here's an example, you can find the right balance of deck control and payload to add. So let's say I'm drawing my deck, and I could buy a peddler, or I could buy a silver. Which one is better for my deck? Well, that kind of depends. If I just want to put as much payload in my deck as possible and I'm not worried about drawing it, then yeah, the silver, that's going to give me $2 next turn instead of $1. But if I'm concerned about drawing my deck, maybe my reliability isn't enough, then maybe I'm willing to give up that $1 of potential payload in order to have a higher chance of drawing my deck. So I might tend towards the peddler. Or maybe I need a buy, and that's the most important thing, so give me that market, right? So these are examples, and this framework is a great way for you to understand the fundamentals of the game enough to know what your plan is, how to execute that plan in the best way possible. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next video.